Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to get us started with some housekeeping before we get into all the great presentations that we have. Okay, so first, this event is being recorded and the recording is going to be posted online afterwards. You can hide captions or show captions and adjust settings with the live transcription button. We also have speaker biographies and slides available online at urban.org on our event page. So you can check those out now or look at them later following the event. All of our participants are muted just to make things easier so we don't have background noise going on that makes it difficult to hear our speakers. However, if you have a question, you can type it into our questions and comments in the Q&A box at any time throughout. And we're going to have a Q&A at the end after all of our speakers have presented. You can also engage with us online using the hashtag #live@urban. And at the end of the event, we're going to have a survey that we ask you to fill out. We really appreciate your feedback, and it helps us to make sure that we can have great events for you in the future. You notice while I was speaking, a link appeared in the chat. That is the link to the speaker biographies and additional information on our events page. Okay, so that is all I have for you in terms of housekeeping. So now getting into the fun stuff. First off, welcome again. We're really excited to share this webinar with you on the impact of criminal legal system fines and fees on people and communities. I'm Lily Robin, and I work in the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where our center does work on research topics related to community safety, the criminal legal system, and the juvenile justice system, and we provide technical assistance to organizations working in that space as well. A part of that work is providing technical assistance to local nonprofit organizations through the Catalyst Grant Program. A link is going to go in to the chat on that, and you can check out information about our Catalyst Grant Program. That is where our speakers did some of their work related to criminal legal system fines and fees. Marie, I'm going to pass to Marie in a minute to speak a little bit about, there we go, there's our link. I'm going to pass to Marie, who's going to speak a little bit about the Catalyst Grant Program. And just to share a little bit before she gets into that, if you hear the work of these great organizations or what Marie shares about our Catalyst Grant Program, and that sounds of interest to you and your organization, we have a solicitation coming out soon, shortly in a few weeks, that you should check out. And you can find information about that and all the work of the Catalyst Grant Program on the link that was just put in the chat. So I'm going to pass over to Marie to introduce herself and share a little bit about the grant.
Thank you, Lily. Appreciate that. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone. Marie Pryor. I'm the Senior Program Manager of Innovation and Community Justice Reform Initiatives at Microsoft. And so Microsoft Justice Reform Initiative is really honored to support the Catalyst Grant Program now in its 4th year in collaboration with the Urban Institute. And we've focused our efforts since 2019 on really advancing racial equity in the criminal legal system. And JRI, our acronym, sits within the Technology for Fundamental Rights Department in Microsoft. So that tells you how we think about this work. And the Catalyst Grant Program in and of itself aims to empower organizations that are dedicated to creating meaningful change and advancing justice reform. And we're incredibly proud to have supported the work that's been done to understand and mitigate the impact of fines and fees on individuals and communities from our 2 great speakers you'll hear from today. And through our grants, we've been able to provide resources and support to nonprofit organizations that are at the forefront of this and similar important work. Quickly, the goals of the Catalyst Grant Program are to empower nonprofit organizations to advance racial equity in their local communities throughout the United States, and to optimize the use of data and technology in service of that first goal. And lastly, to amplify the work of these organizations, which is what brings us here today to this webinar. Just a little bit about the history of the Catalyst Grant Program in terms of geography. We've supported 91 projects to date from 31 different states. That includes Hawaii, as well as the territory of Puerto Rico. over the past four cohorts. And some notable areas of clustering around the country have been Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, St. Louis, Missouri, 5 projects from the state of Wisconsin, a few from Cook County, Illinois, in addition to some of the areas you might expect, like LA County, New York City, and several different cities in Texas. And we really strive year over year to have representation from all over the United States in lesser known places, rural areas, tribal lands, and we've really been intentional about targeting new locations in each cohort. I understand as I'm speaking in the chat will be posted some Catalyst publications if you want to learn more about some of the great work that's been done. I encourage you to check out the work of these other grantees that Urban has advanced through their own scholarship. And at this point, I'm really excited to hear from our presenters today, and I will turn it over to Arvind and Susan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just waiting to get some slides up. Susan and I are here to talk about some of Urban Institute's recent work on fines and fees and how they impact families' well-being. But before we get started on the specific project, I want to give you a little bit of a background on Urban Institute's body of work around fines and fees. A lot of Urban's work in this area has focused on how governance, criminal legal systems, and state and local governments in general can more effectively and equitably operate and deliver services. And so a lot of our focus so far has been around the question of revenues. How many state and local governments rely on fines, fees, and forfeitures for revenues? What implications does that have for the impacts that those fines and fees have on families, whether those revenues are volatile, whether those revenues remain stable over time, and also where the money goes from fines and fees once they come in through the door, which programs they're funding in criminal legal systems and outside of criminal legal systems. One of the big findings we had in our first project highlighted there on following the money on fines and fees was that in a lot of places, fines and fees fund a lot more than criminal legal systems. Healthcare programs, highway administration, a lot of these programs also tend to rely on fines and fees. And what does that mean for a revenue source that is relatively volatile and relatively inefficient in collecting? What does it mean for government programs to be relying on those revenues year over year? Another project that covered fines and fees was around the scale and dispersion of parking tickets. We looked at parking city data from Austin, Minneapolis, and Portland and saw how many pocket tickets are being issued, where are they being issued, what is the structure of parking ticket fines and fees, and what implications does that have for families in those 3 cities. So these are some of the Urban Institute resources that you can find on our website. Today, in particular, we'll talk about that 4th bucket, the work on how fines and fees impact family well-being, how prevalent are fines and fees, who they are impacting, and the consequences they can have for their lives. Going to the next slide. So in this project, we use Urban Institute's 2023 Well-Being and Basic Needs Survey, which is an annual survey that Urban Institute has done since 2017 that looks at a wide variety of social and economic issues, in particular on families' health and economic well-being. We use this survey to add a module of questions on criminal legal fines and fees and their related debts and their consequences for families. The big benefit of this survey, there's been excellent survey data in fines and fees before as well, both national and at the state and local level. The big benefit for doing this survey was the cross sections that we could see this data with the demographic and socioeconomic and well-being factors of these families. Our big takeaway from the project was fines and fees are prevalent. The ones that are issued around courts or incarceration-related violations are in particular really straining the well-being of families who are already experiencing a lot of financial instability in their lives and already experiencing material hardships. And as you may have seen from the literature before as well, the consequences and the costs of these fines and fees are not equally borne. They are disproportionately borne by families of color. So on to that first point about prevalence, we saw that 1 in 6 non-elderly adults, around 17% of families reported that they incurred fines and fees in 2023. For the most part, those fines and fees were incurred around traffic or parking tickets, less so from court or incarceration-related fines and fees, which were 3%, but that's still 3% of nationally representative data. About half of all adults with court or incarceration-related charges also received traffic or parking tickets. So there were a lot of families with multiple fines and fees obligations. As I mentioned earlier, there were racial and income disparities that we observed with fines and fees. Black and Latine adults reported being charged fines and fees at higher rates, 20 and 22% respectively, than white adults. These disparities were significant for both parking and traffic tickets, as well as court or incarceration-related fines and fees. And they were not solely attributable to differences in income. We saw that even among families with very low income, so below 200% of the federal poverty line, Black and Latine adults reported fines and fees at higher rates than white adults. And this is in particular worth mentioning because the Tax Policy Center and Urban Institute have done a lot of work before on how there's a long history of racial disparities in the criminal legal system. In particular, there's a report that you can find on the Tax Policy Center's website on the long shadow of white supremacist fiscal policy, where there's a section talking about state and local governments using fines and fees in their carceral systems in the Jim Crow era to oppress Black families. When we talk about just income, we did not see significant racial disparities in the overall burdens of fines and fees across different levels of income. But for just court or incarceration-related fines and fees, we did see that they were more likely among adults with low incomes than those with middle to higher incomes. And with that, I'll pass it to my colleague Susan to talk about the rest of our findings.
Thanks, Aravind. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the consequences of being unable to pay fines and fees. So in the field, we talk a lot about collateral consequences of the system, and that can be said for fines and fees as well. It means generally that it's not just that people have to pay fines, but there are other things that can happen that further impact those who have to pay fines and fees. So as noted before, those who are experiencing court or incarceration-related fees are particularly strained, and you can see this on the graph as well. Particularly, many adults who were unable to pay their court or incarcerated fines and fees face serious consequences afterwards. So 28% reported being charged additional fines and fees. 24% reported having their driver's license suspended, which can then impact, their ability to get around, go to work, and other transportation needs. And 19% reported serving time in jail. So you can kind of see how it's not just the fines or the fees that are impacting them, but that can also escalate into other issues as well. And so then when we go to look at material hardships and financial insecurity, we can see that adults charged with or owing money for fines and fees reported significantly higher rates of material hardship than adults with no such obligations. Particularly people with court or incarceration-related costs, again, were most likely to experience difficulties affording healthcare. That was 58%, 57%. Reported difficulty with food insecurity, and then other problems paying their rent or mortgage. That was 29% in 2023 as well. So you're really starting to get the picture of how fines and fees continue to impact other areas of life and other areas of financial security as well. So as a part of this project, what we really wanted to do was inform different policy implications here. So what can change makers do? So for one, there's this process of reforming traffic enforcement practices to try and address some of those inequalities that come from traffic-related fines and fees. And as noted, this will all be available online to you afterwards. You can click on these links and read up and watch the webinar that we hosted in January about traffic enforcement practices. Also eliminating administrative fees levied by courts and court-related debts, debts, addressing racial inequities throughout the criminal legal system. As Aravind mentioned, we found that racial inequities were prevalent in fines and fees research as well. So by addressing those issues within the criminal legal system, we can also hope to address inequities in fines and fees additionally. Funding criminal legal systems through general revenue instead of earmarked fines and fees. So one thing that we talk about in our research is just that a lot of the time fines and fees are also used as general revenue for state for local legislatures. So adjusting that can also be impactful. And then additionally, offering alternatives to fines and fees during court proceedings, such as community service, can also help address these issues. And lastly, imposing fines based on a person's ability to pay, which is something that other countries have been doing and could be promising for us as well. So I thank you for this time. I'm now going to pass to Leah and Peter for their presentation on their work.
Thank you so much. Just waiting for the next slide. Oh, looks like I can control the slides now. Hi, everybody. My name is Leah Nelson. I am research director at the Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, where a lot of my work focuses on kind of fleshing out and examining what Arvind and Susan just presented as it plays out in Alabama. So I'm going to start with just kind of setting the stage, because we used our Catalyst grant, and I'm going to let Pete, the next presenter, really dig into this, to do a fiscal analysis of fines and fees in Alabama. But we chose to use the funding to examine that because of what we knew about inequities, both economic and racial. So in 2018, Alabama Appleseed led a survey of 879 Alabama residents who owed fines and fees. All of that is packed up in a big report called Under Pressure, which you can find on Alabama Appleseed's website. Very high level, what we found is that fines and fees were significantly impacting the kinds of choices people made and the options that were available to them. So people were desperate to stay ahead of this form of debt. 83% of them gave up a basic necessity like food or utilities or medicine in order to pay what they owed. 38% of them acknowledged in the survey that they had engaged in illegal activity like selling drugs or theft or sex work in order to get the money they needed to stay ahead of that debt. And 44% of them turned to predatory lenders so they could get the money they needed to pay the state. And even making those desperate choices, more than half of these Alabama residents that we surveyed went to jail in connection with unpaid fines and fees. And this is not on the slide, but I think it's really important to note that in addition to these 879 people who owed their own fines and fees, we surveyed 101 people who only helped others pay, usually close relatives, because they didn't owe their own fines and fees, but they were helping like a boyfriend, husband, son, brother pay fines and fees and stay out of jail. And that 101 group of helpers was demographically distinct from our overall group. So overall, people who owe fines and fees in Alabama represent the prison and jail population here, where Black people are significantly overrepresented as compared to their proportion of the population. So about 60% of our overall pool of people that we surveyed was Black, compared to a state population of about 27%. And that reflects racist policing and other structural factors. But when we looked at these people who were helping others, that group was even more racially skewed and demographically skewed toward middle-aged Black women. So when we think about where Black wealth is going in the state of Alabama, middle-aged Black women were making a lot of desperate choices in order to keep loved ones who owed fines and fees out of jail and prison. And that's just another reason to be really concerned about fines and fees and the way they distort not just the criminal legal system, but also people's like financial security and savings decisions. So if we want to turn all of this horrible news into policy change, which is the goal, we have to think beyond what motivates, an advocacy organization or a human rights worker, and talk with other stakeholders. And what we found in doing that was that the common themes were fair administration of justice, an understandable and transparent system, and making sure victims were okay. So we went ahead and did some more survey work and qualitative interviews with people who were crime victims. And what we found there was that victims and offenders are very often the same people. This has been something that's really important to understand as we go forward and try to make change in Alabama. When we surveyed 401 survivors of violent crimes from communities that experience high levels of violence in Alabama, we find that 70% of the people we surveyed had been convicted of a crime themselves. And that includes 65% of them who had been convicted of a felony. Now, these are people who had survived significant violence. More than half of them had lost someone to homicide. About 60% of them had been beaten. About 40% of them had been raped. So these are people who have been through a lot and who also owe fines and fees pursuant to older criminal convictions themselves. Looking further at how fines and fees factor into victims' experiences, these are all people that we spoke with in depth for that research work. One of the things we found, and Pete's going to get more deeply into this, is that when we follow the money from fines and fees, as Arvind mentioned, it funds a lot of stuff and it doesn't fund it very well. So one of our top findings was that the Crime Victims Compensation Commission in Alabama, which provides emergency funding for things like funerals for homicide victims, relies on funding from fines and fees in order to make those disbursements to victims. And when revenue falls short because fines and fees are very difficult to collect since the people who owe them tend to be poor, then the Crime Victims Compensation Commission can't do its job. So that sort of takes us full circle in showing all of the ways that this system is unjust. And now I'm going to turn to Pete and ask him to talk about effectiveness and efficiency in the system.
Thanks, Leah. As Leah said, one of the things we tackled with this project was really looking from the system perspective and trying to understand, if the court's goal is truly to collect these things, are they actually doing it? And one thing that we communicated to the judges in all of this is that, generally when we think about public revenue, we want that revenue to be collected effectively, efficiently, and really not alter people's behavior. And we would generally frame this in terms of comparing it to other types of tax revenues, which for the judges that we worked with, for a lot of the justice involved folks, really hadn't thought about that from a system perspective. So, I would always tell the judges, we collect property taxes at a rate of 95 to 99%. Of all the taxes assessed, we're collecting most of those. At the federal and state level, you're looking at anywhere from 80 to 90%. And, generally we do a pretty good job collecting sales tax. And so should we expect those same numbers when we think about fines and fees? And if we shouldn't, then why are we assessing those things at such high rates? And so we moved pretty quickly into the data, and Leah did an incredible job working with the judges and some system actors to get us 5 years of case level data in Jefferson County. So we were able to observe over 15,000 individuals across 24,000 cases. Jefferson County is a pretty fragmented municipality. So it's Birmingham is the big city within Jefferson County. And then there are 34 other municipalities with more than a dozen police forces. So essentially a lot of opportunity to look at different municipalities within the system too. And one of the things that we were primarily interested in was just, what percentage of the assessed fines and fees are people actually paying? And generally, how long does that take to pay off? And so we dug into the data. Most of the folks who had a case in Jefferson County were assessed a solicitor's fee, which went to the prosecutors, a docket fee, which went to the court system, a criminal history fee, and then over half the cases had a late fee. And so in Alabama, legislatively, you're assessed a late fee if you're 90 days late. So if you get put on a payment plan, you fall behind in making payments for 3 months, you're assessed a late fee that's 30% of your unpaid balance. So if I start out with $1,100, I pay 10 payments of $10 a piece, and I've got a $1,000 left on my balance. If I fall 90 days behind, now I'm owed. I now owe $1,300. I've been assessed that 30%. A third of our cases had bail, and then, as Leah mentioned, a third of our cases had a fee that went to the Crime Victims Compensation Fund. What we found, though, is that on average, very few of these fees were being paid off. So you see there in red, that's the remaining balance on average. So most folks who fall behind end up never really paying off that late fee. Even in terms of the solicitor's docket, criminal history fee, on average, very few of those ultimately pay off those amounts. And then, unfortunately, for the Crime Victims Compensation Fund, while a third of the cases had that fee assessed, only $7 of the $30 were on average paid off. And what that really meant was a few different things. One, most of the folks who were assessed fees owed upwards of $600. The median amount was $657, as you can see there on the screen. Very few people paid, so the median amount paid, even though the total paid on average was $273, the median amount was zero. Again, meaning half of our cases had $0 paid toward it. That meant that only about 30% of what was assessed on average had been paid. And it left folks with a median amount of about $517 in what they owed, which was a lot of money for the system basically to keep track of in perpetuity. What that also meant was we really had three groups of people. About 54% of folks ended up making no payments whatsoever. So they assessed their fees, and then those were just left hanging. About a quarter of cases, 22.3%, actually completed paying off their fines and fees. And then you had another quarter in the middle who started paying off, and then for whatever reason either stopped paying or weren't able to keep going. And so in many ways, that late fee acted as a deterrent, because you would start paying, you get hit with that late fee, and all of a sudden that amount just seemed that much more. The other thing we found was that really over time, giving people more time wasn't really going to help them. And so, in 2015, so cases adjudicated in 2015, still only a quarter of those cases were ever paid off. If you flash forward 5 years, and we were able to observe people beyond this, but even then, cases from 2019, only 20% of people were paying off. So as we gave people more time, right? If I had a case in 2015, compared to somebody who had a case in 2019, we really weren't clearing additional cases with every year that we got to observe. Now, one of the things that we really talked to system actors about was, one, this was a nationwide problem. The Brennan Center had done some good work. The Fines and Fees Justice Center had done some incredible work as well. We weren't alone in having a bunch of uncollected debt. And really, we were spending a lot of money to go after this debt, or at least to maintain and kind of keep track of this debt. So you can see some cases in Texas, Florida, and New Mexico where it was costing a lot of money just to keep track, or at least to go after those things. And really, what we kind of came away with after this project was understanding that we had to communicate these issues to different types of stakeholders. And so Leah had mentioned earlier about the kind of focus on victims and the Crime Victims Compensation Fund. We ultimately found out there was a priority system in ways in which these fees were paid. And so in many ways, that Crime Victim Compensation Fund fee rarely got paid because it was a low priority. The late fee was always priority number one if you were assessed that. That Crime Victims Compensation Fund would sometimes fall down to 17 or 18. So we had to explain to the court, one, this was a very unreliable source, and Arvin already mentioned this earlier. And so the court really got it that this was bad to kind of think that you're going to bring in all this money and then not. From a system-wide perspective too, a lot of our money flowed to the general fund. And this was also bad because you had this unreliable source and going to the general fund and then going out to different other sources that may not have been connected to funding courts. And then across all of those stakeholders that we would talk to, the system actors, we constantly reminded them that victims weren't receiving restitution. They weren't receiving assistance from the Crime Victims Compensation Fund. And that was really kind of one of the main drivers of that was how the system was set up. And so it was really important for us to kind of highlight the victims themselves, but to really point out that we could make some changes to the system that would allow the money to flow more effectively to them. And so that's what we found in Alabama. At this point, I'm going to pass it to Michael Johnson, who's a senior policy analyst at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, and he's going to talk about some of the hidden cost of fees.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. It is great to see all the survey work and all the incredible work being done in Alabama. And here in DC, at DC Fiscal Policy Institute, we are at the beginning stages of our journey and this fines and fees space. The Catalyst Grant was really the first opportunity that we started with in terms of engaging with this research. And so we are very new into this area, but the Catalyst Grant was extremely instrumental in helping us get off the ground and start to uncover and unpack more of the systemic issues that have been expressed by the urban team and also with the team in Alabama. So in DC, I just first want to just contextualize the entire criminal justice system because DC is very unique and this report, I think, really tried to illuminate the barriers and challenges that we have, particularly in DC, when it comes to understanding the true impact that fines and fees have for families and folks that are incarcerated. And so just to start off, DC is very unique in the sense that we are not a state. And so as a territory, we are our criminal justice system is is highly federalized and very stratified, meaning that during the pre-adjudication process, this is a system that is pretty much all under local control. So at the time of arrest, that's handled by the local police department. And then from there, folks are either held, at the local jail or on conditional release. But then from there, during the adjudication process, that is handled by the DC Superior Court, which is a federal, which is under federal authority. And so from there, depending on the sentence, you can either be placed back in local control at the local DC jail or under federal authority at a Bureau of Prisons prison. So from there, there's a number of different processes where you could be either placed on parole or halfway house. That could be either local or federal authority. But truly, the main point is that, DC is a very federalized system. So there are some parts of the system that are highly localized, some parts of the system that are highly federalized. And what that means is that it really kind of hampers our ability to truly understand the impacts, because there are different requirements in terms of reporting at the local level versus federal level. And then some federal actors like the courts aren't subject to the same information request requirements that local authorities are. So we're in a very unique situation in DC. But on the other hand, there DC is also not unique in the sense that although DC's criminal justice and legal system is highly federalized, it is also highly racialized. And that's, I would say, similar to many jurisdictions across the country. Today, about 90% of Washingtonians, or 90% of the folks that are held in DC jail are Black DC residents. And then when you look at the Bureau of Prisons population, about 95% of DC residents held in BOP facilities are Black DC residents. So a very racially inequitable system when it comes to when we look at the population of folks that are being held. So that's one of the ways that DC is not unique compared to some other jurisdictions. But beyond that, we also wanted to focus on fines and fees. We know that they're regressive revenue generators, meaning that folks with lower incomes, if they are imposed a flat fine or fee, which is typically the case, that a larger percentage of their income will be used to afford that fine or fee. So that places an increased burden on lower income residents as well as Black residents who are compromised, the vast majority of folks being held in jails and prisons throughout DC. And then we also know that this has a deep origins in history and Black codes and especially the criminalizing of Black bodies that really were at the foundation of the creation of DC and many other places throughout the US. So the third reason is again, a lot of what our colleagues at Alabama were pointing to around this perverse budgeting incentives. So we know that fines and fees tend to go to a lot of different pots of funding. And that's one of the things that we uncovered as well in DC. So I want to break up the findings into two main areas. So we first looked at court-imposed fines. And then the second bucket is around specific incarceration fees. And I'll say when I started this journey, one of the most common pieces of advice that I got from other researchers who are working on this issue was around making sure to start with a few specific fines or fees to really narrow down because it does get, it's a very big universe of costs when it comes to the criminal legal system. So I started just with court-imposed fines, and I will also say that these costs were some of the most common costs that were raised. We conducted structured interviews with formerly incarcerated DC residents that really illuminated and shared insight about what are some of the common costs that folks are most experiencing in DC. And so when we talk about court-imposed fines, we are talking about two main buckets. So the first is assessment fees, and these vary by offense, and they are imposed for anyone found guilty of a criminal offense, regardless if that offense involves a victim. These are directly tied to support victims of crime. They are deposited into a crime victims compensation fund. And again, they vary by offense. So for serious traffic offenses or misdemeanors vary from $50 to $250. Felony offenses, they range from $100 to $5,000. And I will say these fines are distinct from criminal offense fines, which is the second bucket. And the main distinction between these is that criminal offense fines are up to the judge's discretion. So these are not automatically imposed, but they can be imposed based upon the judge's discretion. And they can be imposed in addition to one another. So an assessment fine can be imposed upon a criminal offense fine. And they also can be imposed in lieu of any incarceration sentence. And one other thing that I would like to add as well, we're not talking about restitution here. This is a separate bucket, and this can be imposed in addition to the two other fine types that I mentioned. But unfortunately, one of the main barriers that we encountered were around the court-imposed fines. And again, with DC having a federalized system, there is a lack of transparency when it comes to reporting how much revenues are assessed, collected, and even that ability to request information through the courts is not possible through a FOIA, as the federal courts aren't subject to the same information requirements. So an ongoing challenge to try to get some of the really important data to see how much is being collected, the percentage of that are being paid out of the total amount assessed, and so on. But I will say, in addition to these fines are particularly egregious, and I think one of the reasons are related to the consequences for non-payment. So anyone that is imposed court fines and does not pay automatically can have their wages garnished between 20 to 50% of any wages that they make while they're working in the DC jail, but also in federal facilities, up to 50% of their wages can be taken for any unpaid court fines. And then again, when we take into the context the wages for folks who are incarcerated, we're talking about a very small amount, between 38 cents an hour and 50 cents an hour at the local level, and 12 cents an hour and 40 cents an hour and federal facilities on average. So there's already this mechanism for withholding worker wages for folks that are incarcerated if they have unpaid fines. And then even after release, there's also that mechanism for anyone that does have unpaid fines. Those wages can be garnished after they're released. Another consequence of non-payment is parole and supervision revocation. This can be a violation of their terms of release, and as well as up to 1 year of incarceration. So these are just some of the ways that at the local level and at the federal level, folks can be compelled to pay even if they aren't able to. So the next bucket is around specific incarceration fees. And so I will first start with phone and communication fees. So we know that phone and maintaining contact with family and loved ones is really vital for mental and emotional well-being, decreases likelihood of recidivism, but also is just really important for folks to be able to stay in contact with their loved ones. And when we look at, the actual cost in local facilities, phone fees are around 8 cents a minute. And at the federal level, on average, just around 14 cents per minute. So we're looking at between $1.20 and $2.10 for the price of one 15-minute phone call. And again, when we think about these just on their own, it might not seem like that much, but when we compare them to wages, the wages of folks that are working while they're in a jail or prison facility, just at the local level, it costs on average just more than 2 hours of work to afford just one phone call at the highest wage, and even higher at the federal level. So when we compare them to the actual wages that folks are working, we can see how deeply unaffordable these fees are. And again, these are on top of any fines that have already been imposed, any wages that are already being garnished. So when we think about this in terms of the system, it gets very, very unaffordable. In DC, the private service provider via PATH does receive the phone fee revenue. These aren't distributed into a general fund or a specific fund. So there is that lack of transparency there as well. The next fee that we looked at as well around commissary fees, and commissary, particularly within the context of the DC Department of Corrections, is really an essential tool to combat hunger, particularly given the poor quality meals provided in the DC DOC. When we looked at a survey of folks incarcerated in the DOC facilities, over 70% responded that they were served spoiled or rotten food during their time there. So we know that commissary is often a vital tool to just meet the meals that folks need throughout the day. And when we look at the revenues, we see that only about 15% of that, the revenues that have been generated through commissary fees were used for what's called the Inmate Welfare Fund, which is to provide goods and services that benefit folks being detained based on priorities set by the Inmate Welfare Committee. They've been used for educational programming, reentry services, recreational equipment in the past. But again, this is only a very small drop in the bucket of the total revenues that are being raised by commissary fees. Over about $2.5 million on average are being raised through commissary fees, and only a very small fraction of that is being used to reinvest into the populations. And then the last bucket that we focused on are room and board or work release fees. And so this is a fee that is charged for anyone that is in a halfway house that engages in work outside of the facility. And automatically, whether or not there is an unpaid financial obligation or not, there is a 20% fee on all wages earned while working in a work release program. And these revenues are deposited directly into the general fund. So there is that, being shuffled into the other resources and revenues that the district raises. And, one of the more interesting things that we looked at is really comparing them to other basically tax rates that are imposed. And, when we look at it compared to the top tax rate for folks earning $1 million or more, it's nearly double that. And so this is a fee that, is typically, very, very egregious compared to what folks who are earning a higher higher income would make. So the last thing is just some opportunities for reform. There are a number of recommendations that we lifted up in the report. The first is around increasing transparency. Again, DC is a very federalized and stratified system, so there's definitely a lot more coordination that was required, but also the elimination of specific incarceration-related fees. And then the last bucket involves really thinking about the systemic level perspective and making sure that folks have supports as they're coming home, as they're incarcerated. And again, this is just the start of a lot of this work. Definitely understand too that there are a lot more things that we hope to be focusing on as we get further into our journey, but definitely happy to answer any questions, and I'll pass it over to Lily to close us out with questions.
Thank you, Michael, and all of our presenters. So I'm going to take a little time for our Q&A. I did see a few questions just come in the last few minutes. So I haven't had a chance to look at those. But I know a few came in for Alabama Appleseed while they were presenting, so I'm going to start with those questions. I'm going to just read both of the questions to you, if that's okay, because I think they're possibly quick and easy answers. But so the first is, are the late fees that you mentioned 90 days past due assessed even if the person is incarcerated? And the second question was asking if outstanding fees strip people of voting rights in Alabama.
Okay, so the first question, are the late fees assessed even if a person's incarcerated? They should not be, but that doesn't mean they aren't, because I think it is not necessarily the case that courts are notified when a person's incarcerated. So given everything else that doesn't happen the way it should with regard to fines and fees and notification of incarceration, I think it's fair to assume that that could happen even if it's not supposed to. And to your second question, do outstanding fees strip voting rights in Alabama? Yes, they do. Not for every conviction, but for a pretty long list that actually grew a great deal this year. If you haven't finished paying your fines and fees, you are not eligible for restoration of your voting rights, even if you've otherwise finished your sentence. And I should say the research that Pete and I presented today is just a slice of what we're doing with the data that we got. And we have someone looking at the voting rights connection, because that's obviously incredibly important to everyone.
Thank you so much. And then it looks like I have 2 questions for DC Fiscal Policy Institute, and then a more general question if we have time. If not, in our thank you email that we send after this to all of you attendees, we can see if our great speakers can share and answers to any of the questions we don't get to. So the first one for the DC Fiscal Policy Institute is Dr. Johnson mentioned that the fines are sometimes offered in lieu of prison time. Is that viewed as positive, since it might be less of a financial burden for a family than having a breadwinner behind bars?
Yeah, I can take that. So I would say, I think one of the things that we want to look more at is how often that happens and the extent to which that occurs. I think definitely the more we can do to reduce and reduce the amount of incarceration, the prevalence of incarceration, the better. I think we should also be thinking about other ways other than just fines, particularly because so many folks that are incarcerated and have contact with the criminal legal system are low income. So I think there's other alternatives that we can be thinking about. I know some places have been thinking about community service and other alternatives other than just fines. But yes, I do think there's more data that we should be getting to see just how often that happens.
Thank you. And the other question I saw, I know a few more are coming in as I speak, but the next one I saw already in the chat was that you mentioned fines at, Dr. Johnson mentioned fines at, oh wait, sorry, I'm reading the same question. There we go. Okay. It looks like this is an industry highly integrated into the government. Is there anything being done to end this or at least curb it? That was a question that came in during the DC Fiscal Policy Institute presentation, but I'm going to open it up. I'll start with you, Michael, but also Leah and Peter, if you want to jump in after, feel free.
So in Alabama, we are doing a lot of work to curb this. Because this is both a criminal justice and tax policy question, it means we have to work with twice as many stakeholders, but it also means we have two ways of approaching why this needs to be fixed. And actually, the tax policy approach has been a really game-changing way of talking about it here, because criminal justice reform is hard. It makes a lot of people it's very polarizing. I guess I'll put it that way. And racial justice is very polarizing. And I'm sure that's not only true in Alabama, but it absolutely is true in Alabama. But we're talking about money, right? And the research that we have been done, and particularly that Pete's been able to flesh out with his public finance expertise, shows us that the system isn't just unjust. It also is not working very well to collect revenue. And it even points us towards some really sort of counterintuitive until you think about it findings, like people who are assessed less debt at the time of conviction and sentencing pay more in actual dollars. So it's not just that they pay a higher percentage of what they owe, they hand over more money to the government. So when we talk about it that way, and this is a cash-strapped state, that can kind of break the logjam of accountability, because we're not talking about not holding people accountable. We're talking about holding them accountable in a way that is reasonable. And that's really been very helpful. So we're going to continue to do that work in Alabama. And I hope that, I know that we're not the only place that's experimenting with different ways of talking about this to see if we can get past the logjam that happens whenever you talk about criminal justice reform.
Anyone else want to add to that? Otherwise, I'm going to wrap us up since we're close on time. Okay. All right, well, thank you. I know there were some really fantastic questions that we didn't get a chance to answer. I'm going to do my best to wrangle some answers for all of those before our thank you email goes out. So just to wrap us up, one, you might have seen that there's a link in the chat. Please take 1 to 2 minutes to fill out that survey. Like I said, we get this feedback and it really helps us. I know I have taken feedback that I've received about how we facilitate Q&As and implemented it, and hopefully you appreciate my improvements based on previous feedback. So please fill out that survey. Also, just a reminder, if you're an organization that is interested, that thinks the Catalyst grant might be a good fit, the link to that information is in the chat, but also on our event page if you want to visit and see that later. And I think that's all of my closeout, and we are at 2 o'clock. So thank you to all of our speakers. I really appreciate all of the great work that you've done and that you've shared with the Urban Institute and all of our attendees. And thank you to all of our attendees for coming and joining us today. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.